Hello, everyone, and welcome to Great Lean Leaders Making the Business Case. I'm Dr. Shannon Flummerfelt, and I'm pleased to have here with us today Mr. Jack Russell from Rolar Products. He has a wonderful story of lean leadership to share with us. So I'd like to just start off, Jack, with talking with you about what is your current position and title in Rolar Products. I know you've gone through a massive growth story, and there's been a lot of growth and development and change that's gone along with that. So tell us about your current position and title. How long have you been doing this kind of work, and what got you interested in this to begin with?
I am president of Rolar Products, Jack Russell, president of Rolar Products. I purchased the company about 8 years ago. So I've been in that role ever since, kind of chief cook and bottle washer. That goes along with the president's title.
I love that, because that shows that, you have a great propensity for what we call servant leadership, and to be humble as a lean leader is real important, and you do what needs to be done, right?
Right, exactly.
That's great. So can we back up from there? Because I know you said you purchased Rolar Products, and you also have an interesting biography and background. So can you give us some highlights from your career, some of the accomplishments you had before you came to Rolar, some of those experiences, to help us to understand what makes you tick as a lean leader?
All right, I'll only go back 15 years. I can go back way further than that. So I spent 21 years in the automotive industry, primarily with the transplants. So I worked for a tier one automotive company. When I went there, the company was about 30 million in sales. And when I left, it was just under $1 billion. So there was no transplant work when I got there. That's one of the things that I got thrown into. And when I left, there was about $500 million in transplant work. So that's Honda, Toyota, Nissan, Mazda, Mitsubishi, and Subaru. So I've had the opportunity to be trained kind of all over the world, primarily by the Japanese in lean, and seen plants all over the world, and understand how it works no matter what culture you're in.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, because, as we look more and more at the importance of lean leadership, it truly is a global, it's a global application. It doesn't really matter what your setting is, and you've had a chance to see that all over the world. So, I mean, there are different cultural interpretations, of lean and what that might look like, but it's interesting that you've had those experiences. That's great. So can you tell us in the present now, where you are in your lean journey at Rolar Products, and how did that start? Was it when you purchased the company, or had it been going on before? Can you just tell us a little bit about that piece of Rolar so we can understand the context that you work in now? And, even things that, when you first bought the company, I'm sure there are things that went great and things that didn't go so well. So are there things that you can share with us that help us to understand the idea of this being a journey, and not simply an event of just purchasing a company?
Absolutely. It's been an interesting process, obviously, coming out of automotive with the transplants. It's very disciplined, very organized. And when you buy a shop with 3 employees and, old equipment, it's kind of hard to see the lean journey when you first walk in the door. So there was very little, if any, workplace organization, et cetera. But one of the first things that I did is I said to the employees, what do we need to do? And that, well, the first thing you need to do is get us more trash cans. I went, you need more trash cans? Yeah, we need more trash cans. I went, all right. So I get in the car, I drive to the Home Depot, whatever, buy trash cans, buy all the lids, I put them all out, trying to just give people what they need to do their job better. That was their interpretation at the time. And Then they said, what'd you get the lids for? We don't need lids for those. We just need garbage cans. It's like, okay. So, I learned a lesson, and it was that beginning of that lean journey where you ask people what they need and what they want, and then you listen and you hear the reaction, and you continue to just build from that trash can story, to where we are today. We're not all the way where we need to be. I don't think anybody ever is. Um, Workplace organization 5S, we've started that Kaizen foam, and we don't manage it well enough, and we've had to start back over again, which is not unusual in most companies either, where we're not this well-oiled machine that you have to wear white gloves when you work on our floor, because there's still tons of room for improvement.
That's great. Well, I mean, I think that idea that many people think that leaders are the key articulators of what's needed. And it's interesting that you've flipped that model on its head by understanding the employees are the ones who can tell us really what is needed in the organization. And you start with a question rather than a statement. How can I help you? And then you learn
Right.
it. So that's really very, very powerful. So when you think about your own growth pathway, Jack, and you've just had this wonderful career and had a chance to see global operations and experience the actual Toyota training and so on, which many of us haven't had the pleasure of being able to do. So when you think about that, are there some key, maybe 3 to 5 key events or issues or opportunities that when you look at your background and you say, wow, if that wouldn't have happened, that would have really, impacted my journey as a lean leader. So what are some things that really added to your success and have helped you to better internalize what it means to be a lean leader?
Uh, One that comes to mind, one of the first products that I launched when I was at Shape was the 96 Civic front and rear bumpers. And we were one of the first companies ever to export to Japan and have it used in a Japanese plant before they used it in the United States. Most of the time they'd make the United States plants take them, make sure all the quality stuff was worked out before you started sending to Japan. So I was over there multiple times during the trial phases where you ship a load of parts open, and it's a big ceremony. There's 5 crates there, and they're going to open them up with white gloves, and we're going to inspect everything that from the packaging right down to the parts. And to be there and see that happen, and the detail that they go through, even in observing if the packaging had rust on it or if it was sealed properly, all that attention to detail. And then we ended up having some defects in the parts, and they had described them to me, and I said, I know how that part's made. We we couldn't have done that. Well, in the last batch you sent some like this. And I was saying, the machine can't make them like that. So they just went, come here, and they walked me over into a corner, and they said, well, you did it 6 times on the last shipment. So one of those things you'll learn is to never, you always listen and wait to see the evidence before you jump to a conclusion that I couldn't have done that. There's no way that can do that. And I looked at that, and we didn't just miss the mark, we missed the mark by a whole bunch. And I called back to the plant that evening and said, okay, here's what happened, here's what I saw. And they said the same thing I did. Well, we can't do that. That die won't do that. It's like, well, I've got evidence that says we can't. So that's one of those key moments when you realize anything can go wrong, anything can happen, and it's the worst thing you can do is jump to a conclusion, especially if you're innocent or you can't make a defect like that. You have to take people at their word that they can that we can actually make product that was defective, even though when we thought we couldn't. So you're never done. We thought we had it pokey out, and you're just never done. So
Yeah.
that's one of those times.
That's great. And I think, like you say, the best laid plans, right? When you thought you just had it nailed and it was all ready to go. And then, the idea that it's good to take a look at the evidence. What do the data show you? Whether it's, real-time observational data or any other kind of data, instead of jumping to a conclusion, that's really very hard to remain open-minded and have that, that discipline. So was there anything else you wanted to share on that point, Jack?
Not on that one. I think the other thing I realized early on in my career, again, I was in a conference room in Japan with one project manager, and we had probably 30 stamping dies that we were managing at different phases of, completion, and there was a target date, and there was an engineering change. And my project manager and I were there to deliver the message that there's no way we could meet that timing. And we walked through and explained over and over, like, we're going to have to tear this die apart. And they let us explain all the reasons why it could not be done. And they just said, okay, we understand many reasons why it cannot be done. We only need to know one thing. How can you?
Hmm.
So there was no room for excuses. The car had a launch. So it makes you think differently when they go, well, if you did anything, everything, could you do it? And ultimately, obviously, 96 Civic launched on time. We were able to figure out a way, even though I said we couldn't. Right. So that's another thing in lean and in attention to detail and continue to drive for that improvement, even when everybody says it's impossible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example of zero defect thinking. When you think you're done and you've gone as far as you can go, and there's a gap there. The challenge is, do we enter into that and see if we can go further and get where we need to get and really get to zero defect? And yeah, it's very surprising sometimes how far you can actually go if you let yourself take on that, that ability to think critically and openly. Well, thank you for sharing that, Jack. That's great. So when you, all these wonderful experiences and, informative, they're all lessons learned, right? All these experiences as they pile up, good and bad, great and ugly. But there must have been a point in your career when you decided to step into a leadership role. Can you tell us what your pathway to lean leadership, how did that formulate for you? How did you get to where you are now? Because obviously you're very highly regarded in the lean community as an effective lean leader, and you're very busy simply trying to help others and even provide consulting services and so on. So how did you get to that point from where you started? Can you tell us about what that pathway looked like?
I think it was in some ways by osmosis, as I had spent time in Japan directly with the customer, seen their plants, see how the plants in Europe or Japan are exactly the same as there in the United States, that standardization. And then I would look at our own manufacturing, and it was all over the place, right? It was not locked down like most US companies aren't. And this was, almost 30 years ago now. And I ended up being frustrated because our plant management didn't understand what I'd already learned, those lessons I'd learned from observing, the Asian OEMs and how they conducted business. So I kind of inserted myself at that point because I said, no, you have to do it this way. There is a way. We have to figure out a way. So it was kind of a gradual, you know, insertion of myself into that process because I knew it could be done better. I knew there was a methodology to do it better. And our management on the manufacturing floor hadn't gotten to that point yet.
Yeah, that's really interesting that I think sometimes people think that lean leadership is a formal title, like you have president and so on in your title, but that's not a lot of times the way that it starts. It's more of an informal, situational response that you can make to try to help meet the needs that are present there within, your process, your people, your organization, your customer, all of that. And you make a choice. And sometimes, that can be a little risky to be the one who speaks up and says, here, we can do this a different way. You're challenging the status quo or maybe something that has already been acceptable. Was that a scary conversation for you to have, or how did you feel about engaging in that? Really like a challenge to let's rethink this and have people go along with you on it. What did that feel like? What were you sensing at that time?
I think back to a time when this was a Toyota project, when we had a line go down, and as anybody in automotive knows, there's 2 days between you and shutting a plant down. And we were day one of shutdown. Toyota flew in management. It's a Saturday. I was supposed to be playing in a golf tournament. Obviously, I didn't play in a golf tournament that day. I was sitting there as a member of management, and they told us they wanted, in the next 24 hours, they wanted an accounting of what happened every minute. And they'd allow us 5 minutes a shift that we didn't know what happened. Other than that, I got to know what happened every minute of every shift. And we're trying to get back up and running and then run faster, trying to turn that speed up. And as we talked through that dialogue with the person from Toyota there, I thought about it and I went, maybe slower is faster. And that guy from Toyota turned to me and looked at me and said, you could work for Toyota. Because the issue that was happening is we'd go faster and the machine was more likely to break down if we went faster. And if we just
Mhm,
ran at a slower but constant pace,
mhm.
you'd make your rate. And that the whole lean thinking is you only need to make them as fast as you consume them. So the overproduction was, it became obvious to me in some of those meetings, but with the customer there, even then helping to train in those just key, they're very simple concepts, but sometimes in traditional manufacturing in the United States, if you just make it faster, it'll make it all better.
Mhm.
So that's another kind of key turning point for me where I started to more and more insert myself into that approach to make sure that we were running at the right rate, at the right pace. Even though it wasn't necessarily my role, I butted head with manufacturing a few times, to
Yeah,
just apply some of those principles that they hadn't been trained in yet.
sure. Yeah. And just being able to model that, you butt heads, but then you also model it, uh, which is great. And it is interesting because, traditionally the automotive industry has been based on not on what we would call just in time, delivery and, just enough. And it's based on having all the piles of inventory, which of course Toyota could not do that. They simply didn't have the land to have the big warehouses like
Right.
we have down in, the Rouge River area with Ford and so on. So that's really interesting because it's, having that paradigm shift that is significant, and the implications operationally are really, really significant. So that's a great story. So when you think back and this gentleman who turned to you and said you could work for Toyota, were there any key people who you could highlight for us? Maybe you don't want to call them out by name, but at least by role, who were helpful to you in your pathway and within lean leadership. And, were you mentored, and do you believe that's critical to mentor and be mentored as a lean leader or to become a lean leader? Can you just talk about that whole piece of having some kind of support, having some kind of an advocate, a mentor, uh, or mentoring others as well, and what that means to you as a lean leader?
I think it's a mix of all of those things. Some of it is book learning, that you kind of learn the principles and then go observe. And I think that's a key way to pick up on some of those skill sets that you talked about. Um, Trying to remember the second part of your question.
The mentoring and, were there key people who
Ah,
stepped in with you, or, did it just kind of evolve through conversations and your learning and your, learning by doing on the job? How did that work for you? How you were
a
able
lot of
to gain that knowledge and confidence?
Yeah, a lot of that was the because one of the first projects I launched was 96 Civics, which obviously we sent to Japan before we supplied in the United States. So I was over there every 2 weeks when shipments would arrive, and you go to the plant and you do trial builds and those kind of things. And there were several of the Japanese quality managers that even though I didn't speak much Japanese and they didn't speak much English, they would constantly communicate so that they became kind of my mentors as um, experts in the field, in the actual place, in the actual moment. What are they looking for? And I would watch to see not only our components, but the other components and the care that was taken to pay attention to the detail, especially early in the launch of a project, right? Early in when there's going to be potential for way more defects. So, that discipline, that lean discipline really started in that quality assessment, which ultimately drives everything anyway.
Hmm.
Right? You can make them fast. If you can't make them right, it doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah, that's really good. It's the in the plan, do, check, adjust cycle, to have someone model that for you, that we are going to check and audit and then make an adjustment. It's not just getting it done and off the line and into the inventory. It's a matter of, like you say, not how fast, but does this pass our quality standards? And that whole quality assurance mentality really does require a different thinking routine and a different way of actually conducting the work that you do, which I find that's really interesting, an interesting example that you share, Jack. So would you say, with the learnings that you had along the way, was this development for you as a lean leader? Was there something that was, catastrophic, that, major crisis, major turning point that helped you to really, where it all started to click? Or was it gradual and, learning by doing over an eventual time period? How did that work for you for your growth pathway?
And I think it was a lot of it was gradual because when you deal with Honda or Toyota and you attend their supplier conferences, you don't get far away from lean and efficiency and repeatability and quality. It's almost you're like in this, I don't want to call it a cult, but you're in that whole world of the entire focus of the operation and the company is to provide the best products at the lowest possible price. And the only way you can do that is through lean practice. So we did have, just the faith in the system as well. We had a project that late in the game, we had gone through all the crash tests because we did impact energy management. So we did bumpers and they had to pass all the IHHS crash tests and all those kind of things. And I was at a final build at NUMMI back when NUMMI was still building cars for Toyota. And chief engineer came and walked through one of the builds that we had, and I'm standing there and he looks at our part and he goes, "Ugly part, must change." And I went, hmm. And you couldn't see the part, you know, if you're looking through the hood, it had covers over it and everything, but he knew what the part looked like.
Yeah.
And we spent the next 8 months changing that part because he didn't want it, his people who bought that vehicle to look at that part and think that somehow it was bad because it was a free form shape and one of the forms on the bumper. And he didn't like that it wasn't consistent, deadly consistent. And
Mm-hmm.
they spent a lot of money to make that part look different. So
Wow.
it's not necessarily lean, but it speaks to that consistency of repeatability. If it changes back and forth, something's wrong.
Yeah.
And that's a lean principle that made him make that decision. Now we spent 3 years trying to change it back, which we eventually did, but
Yeah.
that's another story.
No, that's really interesting because, if you're just looking at the part, yeah, it works, but he's thinking about it from the broader stakeholder viewpoint, likely. What does the customer see? What about if you have to deal with that part and change it out? Would you recognize it? So the waste that's created by that inconsistency, I mean, it's really Six Sigma is, you're trying to get to that level of consistency where there just aren't errors, there aren't variations and defects in what's out there. So that's very, very interesting story. So when you think about your own lean leadership practice, Jack, can you tell me, are there particular philosophies that you adhere to that have made a lot of sense for you, and that, if I were to come to Roll Our Products and talk to your employees, they would say, yeah, this is the philosophy here that the executive team is implementing at Rolar. Are there philosophies that are really clear to you, and then do they cascade down throughout the organization? Can you talk with us about the framework for thinking and the theories that drive you as a lean leader at Rolar?
Yeah, it's easy as we know, or some people may not think it's so easy, but in high volume production, lean is easier than it is in small volume production. And I think a lot of the people that will listen to this, they're not building 1,700, Camrys a day out of a manufacturing plant. They're building 500 of this and 500 of that. So some of the key things in a smaller organization like that, you have to focus on a little bit differently. And to me, it's one of the key things is there's only one way to do it, because we have shifts that take over behind somebody else, and they'll move a table over because the guy likes the table on his left instead of on his right. We're only going to make 500, and it's easy to get in that rut of, well, as long as we get them done, it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I keep saying over and over and over, and we're not perfect yet. We're running a fairly high volume part today where we're making 10,000 parts a week, 5,000 off at 2 different machines. And that started early on where the guy goes, I don't like the way he had it set up. So second shift comes in and they rearrange where all the product flows. And it's like, no, they think it's easier, but I said there's only one right way. If you want to change it, a typical lean process, right? Experiment, right? So you say how you like it. Both of you run it that way, gather your notes, and then try it the other way and come up with a hybrid, or maybe one way is better than the other. So those are some key takeaways, I think, that are part of lean, but they're things that if you start there, at least to do the work consistently, it's easier to see the other anomalies as you get further down. The same way is capability studies. So we're fairly small volume compared to automotive. We may run thousands of parts, but not hundreds of thousands of parts all at the same time. And the capability study, I just did this on that part that we talked about, that's high volume. And we'd ship some parts that were slightly out of spec. And in a job shop mentality, those of you who run a job shop, most machinists think that a perfect part is a part that is nominal on all dimensions. And that's not a perfect part.
Mm-hmm.
And I would repeat to them, I don't get paid any more for those parts that every dimension's right in the middle of the tolerance band.
Mhm.
right? So we had a part that had gone out. So I took a spreadsheet, put a spreadsheet together, went out and we started measuring parts. I said, check 1 in 5, we're going to run 100 parts. And I said, here's what I think is going to happen. I did this right with the employees on the floor. I think that this size is going to get um, smaller over time, and we're going to start on the high end, and we're going to let it run and let's see what happens. Here's what I think is going to happen. So as they walked over and plugged the data in, as we measured 1 in 5, as we did through 100, they went, it's moving already. It's it's working, right? And those are the kind of moments that you can people can see it for themselves, and you can talk all day, but until they physically type that in, then we plotted the CP and CPK, and they went, oh, so it only goes one way, so we need to start on the other end of the tolerance band so we can run a longer amount of time. All the parts will still be good according to CP and CPK, and the lights go on. So those are some of those practices for the smaller companies. You know, Toyota and those guys have already done those capability studies for years and years, and they already know. But most small companies don't do that when they're making 600 parts a shift. They have no idea where they are in the ranges of all the dimensions. So that's some really good lean practice that I would encourage people to, on a small scale, do. You don't have to be Toyota or Honda to do it.
Yeah, I think that's great. The, those control studies where you're looking to see, what does this mean for us to do this, like you say, perfect part. And then, of course, when you move from a manufacturing setting into a services delivery, that idea of process control and what does standard operating procedure look like, that takes on some additional nuances as well, because it's oftentimes more about, the human to human interaction, or sometimes there's, an AI solution or a technology piece in between that, but it starts to become, the variations are much harder to control as well. But still, in your plant, in order for any of those things to happen, it's like you say, you have to make sure that people have a chance to see it for themselves. They learn to see, as we know, that, that's a key concept, a key philosophy, is that you learn to see, and once you see it, then it's very easy to understand what the countermeasures could be. And so that was great that you took your employees through that learning to see practice. So you've mentioned, Jack, also waste earlier. You talked about overproduction and some other concepts around waste. Do you have particular tools out of the Lean toolkit that you find very helpful in terms of solving problems, getting those gaps eliminated? You mentioned the capability studies through process control studies, but what's in your toolkit in terms of that problem solving, elimination of waste problem, that you're trying to get after all the time?
Well, one of the things we've done, and you know this, we've put data monitoring. So we use Datanomics on our plant floor. So one of the things, the first things you do if you're going to try to solve a problem is you got to know what's happening. You got to have the data. You got to know what's going on. So we have that stream of data constantly flowing by on TV screens all over the plant floor. And it's great to have the data because nobody argues with the data. They know it comes off a computer, it comes from the controller, and it's exactly right. So that gives you an opportunity visually very quickly to see where you need to go spend your time. Sometimes you may see a process that's not running at peak efficiency, but the volume isn't that. I mean, you have to pick and choose your battles. It isn't like an automotive plant. You're running 50 and your efficiency is off by 3 points. I'm not going to worry about that as much as I got one that I run 1,000 a day and I'm off by 1.5 points, right? Or whatever that is. So using that data then to say, where can we be, where should we be, and to pick interim goals. You know, you don't have to go from where you are to perfect either. It's like pick something, collect the data, experiment, right? Lay out that experimentation in a lean practice and try it and see if it changes the data. One of the nice things the software does to speed up that lean practice is it will suggest what your target time should be. It might not be ideal. It's not the fastest you've run that job. And then what happens with employees, again, you got to think like an employee. And you'll say, well, we can run that at 50 pieces an hour. And the employees are going to go, we've never run it at 50 pieces an hour. One of the nice things the software does is it'll pull a whole shift of data where you average 50 pieces an hour and you still had downtime. And they go, oh, but otherwise it's hearsay, right? And
Yeah.
then you can go study. It doesn't solve the problem for you, but it gives you the right tools and the right approach from the employees, you know, to get on board. So one of the things with having data visible as compared to like old school, we're going to go out with a team and we're going to take downtime records, is that people will, once they see data, will self-correct on their own, right? Nobody works 100% of the time, 100% of the time, right? There's always some downtime. So this is a great example. And I'm not trying to sell the software. It's how we build this culture
Sure.
of lean, which is one of the things that I'm trying to do, is to build, not only I know and I can train people on how to do it, but it should be part of your culture that everybody thinks this way. So when we put the software in, one of the things that shows on the TV screens is when the first part was made. And it just says a time. So the employees go, what's that? Just what it says, when the first part was made in the shift. Well, I have to warm it up. I have to run the spindle. It's like, yeah, we know. Well, I have to check those dimensions because it's first part of the day and we have to check them all. It's like, yeah, we know you're supposed to. And they went, oh, and we didn't yell at anybody. And our first part in the shift was made, I don't know, 35 to 45 minutes into the shift. And then we started noticing that time was going down and down and down. It was closer and closer to the beginning of the shift. And we finally asked our employees, what happened? And they said, well, we went and pulled the manuals. And the machine manual doesn't say you have to run. Everybody thinks you have to run that spindle for 20 minutes before you can make a good part, or it'll ruin the machine or whatever. And everybody had that in the back of their mind. They'd start the machine, they go get a cup of coffee, and they knew they did, but they thought they were doing the right thing, right?
Sure.
Once they saw that data and it's, 4 minutes at 200 RPM, push the button, we saw our first part made in the shift go down by 38.28% over
Wow.
about a 9-month period. Nobody yelled at anybody. My plant manager nor I ever had a conversation with anybody about why are you drinking coffee, why are you running around. You put the data out and you tell them what it means, and they will self-correct. So then what happens, once they kind of fix their own things, then they're coming after you. They're going, I've been watching that. And if we weren't doing this, why is that number that? So now they're after me, which is when you know you've reached a turning point in your culture, when you have a conversation about efficiency on your manufacturing floor and your employee starts that conversation, not you.
Yeah, that's exciting. A really great example of employee empowerment and what that looks like, because accountability heightens, when employees are empowered. And, like you say, it's very simple. Yeah, I've talked to some plant managers and, they give the same kind of example where you can just go around and keep hollering at people or blaming it on the machine operators when really it's not the machine operators. It's some kind of a tradition or something about the, what they think is a work instruction when it's really not appropriate to the manual. Or it could just be that they don't know how to come to leadership and say, look, I see this problem. So it can be cultural, it can be all kinds of things. And I think that's just a great story for those who do work with work with others, and you're wondering, when are they when is this going to when is this efficiency or quality or whatever the problem is going to change? So that's really great. So with that in mind, then the Rolar has had just a tremendous success story, and I wanted to ask you about a lean tool, or it's a method. It's called Hoshin Kanri, where you go through a strategic planning and a strategic management function or activity over, a period of time, however long it makes sense for you to plan strategically, driven by your true north. What are your vision, values, goals, critical essential parts of your company. And so I wanted to ask you, do you use Hoshin Kanri or strategic planning and management? And if so, what does it look like? If not, why not?
We have ISO reviews quarterly, right? And part of that whole ISO process is goal setting for what the company size should be, quality, all of those kind of things. So I would say, yes, we do. And we review that quarterly to make sure that we're on track. When we first started that, we set a sales goal, right? Who knows, when you buy a company that's doing $600,000 a year, what's your goal? What do you want the ultimate company to be? How many employees? And 8 years ago, we set that at $10 million, right? And 40 employees or whatever the number is. So we're at the 40 employees. We're not at the $10 million yet. So even that has some indication that you might need to change some things, or pricing may need to be adjusted. But we practice also daily. I have this saying that if your employees don't understand how your company makes money, why are you always asking them to help you make it more efficient, right? So if they don't really know, they're going to assume when you start talking about efficiency and lean that you expect them to push that button faster.
Mm-hmm.
And it's more than that, right? You have to get people to understand that what they do matters. From a scrap perspective or a quality perspective, we bring those things up on a weekly basis. We have birthday get-togethers. When somebody has a birthday, we sing happy birthday and they get $50 and a candy bar or whatever. And then we always go through current things that are happening on the floor. And if our scrap isn't reported properly, what does that mean? And so we can bring those things home, so they understand if we'd recorded our scrap or not recorded our scrap. We just had one incident where it was customer supplied material and we didn't document well what we'd scrapped, and it's going to cost us $10,000. And I wouldn't point anybody out, but it's all part of that game that we're playing. The efficiency doesn't mean anything unless they're on board with you and they understand why you have to be efficient. Efficiency by itself doesn't mean anything. And if you can share with your employees why it matters what they do, most companies wouldn't put their pricing on the manufacturing floor either. I do.
Mm-hmm.
Most people are afraid to do that because they say, well, then they're going to know how much I'm making. It's like, well, if you're making that much, maybe, you should be a little more generous with your employees, whatever that situation is. But they need to understand what you buy, what you buy it for, the material, what you sell it for, what they get paid, and, lump that whole thing into a more holistic approach to efficiency. And so to get back to your point, that those lean tools, so we review that quarterly, but virtually daily or weekly, we're looking at those things that are going wrong or off target, and we can start to move that needle on a more regular basis than waiting for some designated checkpoint.
That's great. And I think that is truly where Hoshin Kanri becomes powerful, is when it translates into daily practice. If it's separate from that, then there's still not the connection that you want. And so I think the examples that you shared with us of how to do that are very helpful. And you know, the idea is that every day, whatever those goals are, and you know, if you're transparent about your financial matters, that really helps a lot for people to understand. But the more that can become a part of the daily kata and the daily routine in terms of the thinking about the strategic plan, having that be a part of it, that becomes it just becomes extremely meaningful. And you do have, kind of like you say, a built-in system with ISO and your quarterly reviews. So that's great. And I think, you know, can help a lot, because it's sometimes hard just to start from scratch and do a strategic plan for the first time. I have you know, a couple of clients I work with, and you know, they're like, okay, we haven't done a strategic plan in 10 years. Like, nobody knows what the previous one was. You know, we're trying to get
Yep.
practice going and so on. So it can be quite a heavy lift to get all that going. But you had mentioned your, you know, your vision there with the $10 million, and you know, now where you're at with the 40 employees. Do you take those kinds of goals or benchmarks, or maybe even breakthrough, you know, types of accomplishments would be for Rolar? Do you break those down into any kind of measurement through like an OKR or a KPI, anything that would, you know, help people to translate what that vision means for 10 million? Or, I mean, I know you're sharing your data and they're understanding that. I'm just kind of asking you, how overt are you about that? And do you set overt goals around these kinds of, let's say, financial benchmarks you're trying to hit and so on?
We haven't with the financial benchmarks just yet. We're still obviously in a huge growth mode. You know, we just moved into a, you know, 62,000 square foot building, and it's not full yet. So that means we're not fully utilizing all the space we have that we're paying for.
Sure.
So just trying to think where to go with that one.
Well, you probably are developing some of that, if I may suggest, from what you said, you're developing some of those goals organically as you're sharing data, you know, through your datanomic system with employees, and they're saying, "Oh, I can actually get to this, you know, get to this key performance indicator. I don't need to accept that one." But are there any other examples of how that might work for you there at Roll Products?
Well, we plot all of our scrap and also delivery, because we are much more short run than you know, a tier one would be.
Hmm.
We track our order sizes kind of uniquely in that um, I always measured in PPM from a quality perspective, you know, or a delivery perspective. And when you're in the business we're in, I can have a bunch of little orders that are a day late, but I ship, you know, 100,000 parts in the month that weren't late, and your PPM is going to be terrible. So what we've done is we've developed a system where, depending on the size of the order, so for jobs that are under 500 pieces, what's our delivery rate? And for jobs that are over 1,000 pieces, or there's sliders, you can do it any way you want.
Hmm. Sure.
So instead of just blending that all together, you know, it's much easier in the automotive to get your delivery and quality because you're shipping the same quantities every day. The job shop is a lot more challenging when it comes to that. So that's a unique measurable that we've developed over time, because my ISO guy said, "What does PPM mean? Does anybody know what PPM is?" Not, if you're not in automotive, they don't know what it means.
Sure.
You know, so we track number of orders late, right? Not necessarily pieces. How many times did you disappoint the customer or satisfy the customer? And that's been at the pressing of our auditor to say, get a meaningful measurement that everybody can rally around and get behind and understand what it means. So kind of a unique approach. I had an auditor from a customer that came and said, I've never seen anybody do it that way. Everybody just lumps it all together. So
Right.
that's one of the unique things that I think we do that kind of keeps that focus on and some attention to that short run delivery.
That's great. Well, thanks for sharing that example. You know, in Lean, one of the foundational, well, kind of two of the foundational tools are standardization. So I want to come back and ask you about leader standard work, and you mentioned that at the beginning of this interview, but also the PDCA cycle and what that means for continuous improvement work and thinking. And we document that on a form called, or a template called, an A3. And there's different types of A3s. You know, there's different
Yep.
renditions on it. Some are for strategic use, some are for, you know, daily use or whatever it might be. So I just wanted to ask you, first of all, about the PDCA cycle, and do you use the A3 template in whatever format within Roll Our Products, or is it more of a mindset? How explicit are you about documenting things on A3s?
We have not documented on A3s. Obviously, in my past, I've done that a lot. And, you know, with the employee base we have and, you know, the kind of work we do, that um, it's not as clear cut that you can spend enough time to really document and get enough meat behind it that you can say, well, here's a conclusion. Because many times you have 2 runs of 50.
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to draw conclusions from that? You know, and then, you know, is it valuable? Where do you spend your time? You know,
Yes.
that's one of the things that, where do you spend your time? But one of the things we do a lot of is paperwork improvement, process improvement from an ERP and paper flow and data flow of scrap rates and logging parts complete and material in a smaller company. Again, bigger companies, they've already got that solved, right? They bring consultants in and they spend $5 million and it all just works. It takes 10 years to get it working, right? But as we all know, but um, we spend a lot of time with our employees to go, wait a minute, we need to get this from here to here. How does it flow? You know, where does it go? What could we do? What should we do? And let's try it. So even on the office side, we do probably more of that than we do on the shop floor side because there's just as much waste on the office side that we're chasing paper or people are doing 2 things at the same time. Why are you doing that? I'm not doing it. Or who's supposed to be doing it? We don't know. So we're constantly changing those accountabilities and, you know, who does what and when uh, on a process side on the paperwork.
Oh, that's great. No, that's good to hear about that too, because obviously, you know, lean in the office is really important. Yeah, as opposed to, you know, I guess you know, as a complementary part of the lean leadership work that you do with the manufacturing floor. So when you just reflect about we've only talked about some of your lean leadership practices in this first interview. We'll talk more next time about it. But when you think about how you've grown as a lean leader, have you been able to systematize your leadership work? So I'm not talking about, you know, what happens on the plant floor in your office, but like with you, Jack, as you come into work, uh, and, you know, open the door and come in and say, okay, here's what I normally do. So what are some of the routines or systemization that work for you? And you know, and a part of some of that is what's called leader standard work. So when you're trying to get your standard operating procedures all set in that, you know, have things be the same every time and get rid of variance, you have to sometimes step into that leader standard work mode where you are auditing and you are ensuring that those quality controls, as you do that process control work, is where it needs to be. So can you just talk to us about that? Like, as a leader, how do you look at it? How do you approach it? In terms of the systemization aspects of it for you as a lean leader?
Yeah, I do. Probably the most effective thing, or the thing I do first thing, is like a Gemba walk. I'm going to go out on the manufacturing floor. The advantage is I can glance. By the time our first shift starts like at 5 in the morning. So if I'm here at 7:30 or 8 o'clock, I can already see some historical data on the boards, which is another just huge advantage. You can just walk through and say, how's it going? What I already know, and they already know I know, right? And they know I'm going to ask those questions. Did you start late? What happened? Did we not move somebody to that machine? Didn't figure out they were going to run that machine at that time. And then I'm always looking for